Well, first of all, thanks to Fabio for this invitation to this wonderful conference. I'm very happy to be here. So thanks for the hospitality, also for all the people that made this possible. Since we are all confessing our orientations, I must say that I have a background in Continental philosophy, so I'm really happy to learn so many things about what's going on the other side of this divide. So I will not speak about Sellars or Meillassoux. I will speak about how I understand the importance of Kantian transcendental philosophy today. And briefly, my position is that I think that speculative philosophy is today possible thanks to Kant and not against or in spite of Kant. So I will try to argue why. So let me start with the chronometer. With one of the most basic phenomenological facts, namely that experience is always perspectival, in the sense that we only have access to aspects, profiles, phases, adumbrations of phenomena. This empirical perspectivism, as I will call it, is a consequence of the fact that experience unfolds in a space-time, in which every possible subject is always located in a particular state. That is to say, experience is always correlated to the subject state. By a state, I understand, for instance, the position, the state of motion, etc. Now, according to what we could call the infinite regulative idea of science, scientific knowledge must be universal. This means valid for any subject independently of its particular state. So we could say that the fundamental meta-problem of science is how to go beyond this empirical perspectivism towards universality. That is to say, how can we construct a sort of subject-independent intrinsic description of what's going on in nature. Now, there is a sort of magic formula for passing from empirical perspectivism to universality, which is, let's consider all the perspective at once. Or, more modestly, let's try to shift, to change the viewpoint of observation. By doing so, we can first try to identify the features of the phenomenon at stake, which are invariant under these variations. In nice situations, it might be the case that there is a complete set of invariants by means of which we can describe the phenomenon without any kind of ambiguity. But the invariants are not the only thing which matter. For instance, if I am listening to a piece of music and I'm placed in a particular instant of time, I will have a very partial access to the piece because I will listen what's going on in this particular instant of time. So in order to have a more complete experience, I have to let the time flow and get access to other temporal positions. And in this case, what matters are not the invariant, but is the global structure of the piece. So the global structure of variations. So by performing variations, we can also gain access to all the multiple modes of presentation of the phenomenon at stake and to its global spatiotemporal structure. In this way, thanks to what I will call the method of empirical variations, we can perform the transition from subjective appearances to objective phenomena. It is worth stressing that these transitions from appearances to phenomena or from appearances to objectivity is already at work in ordinary perception. For instance, visual experience does not take place from a well-defined focal viewpoint of observation, since both eyes are placed in different positions, so we have to integrate the information recorded by both eyes, and this integration of information coming from different viewpoints enriches the perception by endowing it with a sort of three-dimensional depth perception. So we have a three-dimensional experience of things because of the fact our eyes are not in the same position. In this way, by integrating different viewpoints in a space-time, we acquire new degrees of depth perception. And we could say that objectivity is nothing but a higher form of this process of integration of a multiplicity of empirical perspectives into a single experience endowed with a higher order of depthness, of depth perception. Now, as you know, Kant formulated what I consider to be one of the most important theses of modern philosophy in its relation to science, namely that the method of empirical variations is not enough for guaranteeing the universality of scientific knowledge. So according to Kant, the so-called scientific universalism is not universal enough. Science remains all too human. And why? Because according to Kant, the objective description of natural phenomena, even if it no longer depends on the contingent state of the particular subject of experience, still depends on what he calls the transcendental structures of human experience. And of course, the transcendental structure of human experience defines just one type of subjectivity among others. We know that there are vegetable, animal, maybe extraterrestrial types of subjectivity, and even the notion of a single universe, of a single human type, is a sort of coarse-grained description that makes abstraction of social, historical, gender, and these kind of differences among human subtypes. So let me introduce the terminology that I will use in what follows. I will say that any empirical subject is always a token of a transcendental type, and that this transcendental type, alpha, defines a position in what I will call the K-space of transcendental types. So I will introduce this notion of a space of transcendental types in which each position defines what we could call a transcendental subject. So, whereas an empirical subject of a given transcendental type occupies a position in a space-time, the underlying transcendental type occupies a position in this K-space. This means that every empirical subject is localized two times, once in a space-time, and this defines what I have called empirical perspectivism, and once in the K-space, and this defines what I will call transcendental perspectivism. These two forms of localization, the empirical and transcendental, entail two forms of perspectivism. Again, the empirical perspectivism associated to the localization of the subject in space-time, and the transcendental perspectivism associated to the localization of the corresponding type in this K-space. So what Kant pointed out, rephrased in my terms, is that the empirical variations in space-time merely allow the subject of experience to absorb experience from the empirical perspectivism, but not from the transcendental perspectivism. That is to say, an empirical subject of transcendental type alpha can modify its state in space-time, while the underlying transcendental type remains fixed at a given point in this K-space. So in short terms, an empirical subject can be a nomad in space-time while being sedentary in this K-space. Okay? So, by doing so, Kant introduced a gap between a sort of type notion of intersubjectivity, or what we could call transcendental objectivity, and this higher degree of intersubjectivity, which is an untyped intersubjectivity or a universality, in the strict sense of the term. So modern science give us access to the first type of intersubjectivity. That is to say, intersubjectivity for empirical subject of the human type. Okay? So here it is important to be more precise. What is a transcendental structure? So in the wake of this very rich history of post-Kantian conjugations of the transcendental, I will call transcendental structures all the structures that make possible subjective experience, such as, for instance, physiological structures, the technological extensions of these physiological structures, the linguistic and discursive frameworks, the conceptual resources, all the paradigmatic frameworks that orient any form of research, and, which is also very important, all the diverse forms of historical, cultural, political, institutional, economical, and sociological structures that predetermine and make possible the experience of the corresponding subjects. So a transcendental structure is something that, in a sense, frames the field of experience, in the sense that it makes subjective experience possible, and at the same time limits the scope of this very experience. So why these structures are called transcendental structures? Because they make possible a restricted form of transcendence that I will call transcendental transcendence. For instance, thanks to the fact that we have eyes, we can go beyond ourselves and have an experience of the optic sensorium in which we are embedded. So, as I said before, the scientific mediation of the empirical perspectivism by means of what I call the empirical methods of variations, that is to say, to change the viewpoint in a space-time, is still limited by this transcendental perspectivism, by the fact that we do not move in the k-space, even if we are moving in a space-time. So we can summarize Kant's position regarding this point by saying that transcendental transcendence is not transcendent enough. So in order to point out toward this transcendental transcendence, Kant introduced the famous threefold distinction between subjective appearances, objective phenomena, and noumena. Here I'm insisting on the fact that we don't have a duality between appearances and things in itself. In Kant we have this threefold distinction. We have subjective appearances associated to a subject placed in a space-time. We have the objective phenomena, which are the result of the variations of the position of the subject in space and time, and we have this sort of transcendental transcendence that Kant called things in itself or noumena. So let us consider an example inspired by the transcendental aesthetics. We can turn around an object in order to gain access to all its aspects, and in this way get rid of the empirical perspectivism. Now, according to Kant, as you know, the very space-time in which our experience unfolds is dependent upon our transcendental type. From the perspective of physics, we could, for instance, argue that our experience of the space-time depends on the scales of energy to which we have perceptual or experimental access. So we could, for instance, conceive spatiotemporal manifolds with more than 4 dimensions, such that these extra dimensions are empirically inaccessible as a consequence of the transcendental structure of our cognitive apparatus. In this line of thinking, as you know, the biologist von Wexkull take this Kantian motif in order to put into question the idea according to which different animals, like for instance a tick and a human being, habit or live in the same space and time. So the importance of the fact that the space and time depends on the transcendental type of the corresponding subject is that this subject cannot afford the same kind of variations of their empirical states because they are moving in different space and times, so their empirical degrees of freedom are different. So the objects that they will constitute by performing these variations will not be the same. Okay? So this transcendental dependence of the spatiotemporal background entails the fact that the object constituted by these subjects will not be the same. So I will say in what follows that nature appears to a transcendental type alpha, to a subject of this transcendental type, in the form of what I will call objective nature, which is unfolded in a sort of transcendental dependent space-time, and which are inhabited by transcendental dependent objects. Everything is transcendental dependent. In our particular case, we experience nature in a four-dimensional continuum, and for some reason we are forced to move forwards in time. So, strictly speaking, we only have three spatial degrees of freedom. So here we arrive to the speculative question par excellence. Is it possible to overcome this transcendental perspectivism and go beyond the transcendental transcendence? Now, my main point here is the following. Exactly as the empirical perspectivism can be sublated by performing empirical variations in space and time, the transcendental perspectivism can be sublated by performing what I will call transcendental variations. So what does it mean to perform transcendental variations? It means to take a walk in the K-space of transcendental structures. In other terms, we have to extend the range of possible variations from variations taking place in a space in the transcendental dependent space-time to variations of the transcendental structure itself. That is to say, to variations taking place in this K-space of transcendental structures. So briefly, as Kant encouraged to do it, we have to rise the Copernican revolution to a transcendental level. So let me stop for a while on the notion of the Copernican revolution. So for me, first of all, the Copernican revolution is a recognition of the fact that the Ptolemaic description of celestial motions depends upon a particular frame of reference, namely a frame of reference attached to the Earth. Here we find a first form of misunderstanding of the Copernican revolution, which is the idea that we could say that the fact that we are physically attached to a particular frame of reference traces some kind of ultimate limits to astronomy that cannot be bypassed by any means. But of course, the fact that we live on the Earth didn't prevent modern astronomy from describing celestial motions from other frames of reference. In particular, we realized that a description by using a frame of reference attached to the sun, gives a much simpler description. It would be ridiculous to argue that the Copernican revolution, by stressing the correlation between the scientific description and the state of motion of the chosen frame of reference, paves the way to any form of idealism or to any form of epistemic limitation of scientific knowledge. So the Copernican reflection on the fact that astronomical data are always correlated to a particular frame of reference, far from limiting the scope of astronomy, was the condition of possibility that allowed astronomy to overcome this empirical perspectivism. So here we arrive to the second form of misunderstanding of the Copernican revolution, which is to argue that the existence of a multiplicity of possible frames of reference and the possibility of arbitrarily or conventionally selecting one particular frame entails a sort of relativism or conventionalism. This is what we could call the problem of relativity. But we will know that the recognition of the fact that we can freely choose any frame of reference within a certain class does not entail in modern science any form of relativism. In particular, in physics and mathematics, scientists have developed techniques by means of which we can extract invariants, we can analyze the overall structure of the variations, and we can integrate all the frame-dependent description into an intrinsic frame-independent description. So I'm sorry, I'm repeating what I have just said. So I understand the notion of Copernican revolution in terms of what I call the reflection-refraction tandem. That is to say, on the idea that the reflection on the particular state of the subject of experience goes along with an object-oriented refractive mediation of this empirical perspectivism, thanks to the fact that we reflect on our particular contingent empirical state, we can go beyond this perspectivism, the perspectivism associated to the fact that we experience from this particular frame of reference. So in Hegel terms, we could say that the Copernican reflection should not be understood as an abstract negation that would trace ultimate limits to astronomy, but rather as a determinate negation by means of which we can transgress the limits put into evidence by the critical reflection. In the same manner, I want to argue that the reflection on the transcendental structure of the subject of science should not be understood as a juridical limitation of science, but rather as a necessary operation thanks to which we can transgress the transcendental limits of scientific experience. Any question? Is it okay? Tiny question regarding what I have just said, not big questions.
This is the two parts of the reflection and fractions again.
Yes, the reflection on the particular state of the subject of experience and the mediation of the limits of experience, which is made possible by this very reflection. So thanks to the fact that we realize that our experience of the celestial motions depends on the particular frame that we are using, thanks to this fact, modern astronomy is possible. Modern astronomy which is not limited by the fact that we live on the Earth. Okay? You're welcome.
It was a big question. I was going to ask, what is to be done?
Huh?
What is to be done?
What is to be done?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
What is to be done?
Well, I don't know. Let's see. So, an important obstacle to the development of this program is what I will call the agoraphobic interpretation of the transcendental critique. According to this interpretation, the transcendental reflection shows that human experience is essentially limited to the transcendental transcendence, defined by the human transcendental structure. Roughly speaking, as you know, the argument is simply that we cannot jump over our own shadows. That is to say that by definition we cannot have an experience which are not predetermined by the very conditions thanks to which we have experiences. That we cannot speak or think about something without subjecting this something to the general conditions of possibility of speech and thinking. So this is the argument. According to this interpretation, the transcendental reflection only plays a critical role. That is to say, its main task is to establish the limits of precritical thinking by tracing both the limits of precritical science and of dogmatic metaphysics. Roughly speaking, this interpretation amounts to maintain that we live in a sort of phenomenal prison surrounded by the so-called great outdoors. Now, my main point is it possible to interpret transcendental philosophy by eliminating both the prison and the great outdoors? Is it possible to remain faithful to the infinite idea of science and to its consubstantial realism against this kind of theological-oriented fascination with these great outdoors, with the unthinkable, the unspeakable, the impossible? So, to do so, we have to localize the problems of what I have called the agoraphobic interpretation of the transcendental critique. And I think that the main problem of this interpretation is based on what I will call an essentialization of the transcendental structure of human beings. That is to say, on the hypothesis according to which the transcendental structure of human beings is a sort of fixed transcendental structure, lacking any possible dynamics. Of course, as you know better than me, this is an hypothesis which is completely unjustified. The different transcendental structures are not God-given, but they are always the result of a process that I will call, in the wake of Merleau-Ponty, processes of institution of subjectivity. For instance, the physiological structure of human beings results from a process of natural evolution taking place within nature. So in a sense, we could say that Kant's work was contemporary of Newton's physics, but for chronological reasons, he couldn't read Darwin's Origins of Species. And of course, even before Darwin, this point was well understood by the thinkers of German idealism. For instance, according to Kant, according to Hegel, it is important to describe the emergence of the different forms of subjectivity, or he argued that we cannot simply take the categories from Aristotle, we have to deduce the categories, or in the case of Schelling, he argued that transcendental philosophy has to be complemented by what he called philosophy of nature, which is a discipline intended to explain the emergence of the transcendental subject. So we cannot take the transcendental subject for granted, we have to understand how it appears. So transcendental philosophy and philosophy of science are different sections of the same circle that Schelling called the philosophy of the identity. So we can state that all transcendental constitution of objectivity presupposes an institution of the corresponding transcendental structures. There is no constitution without an institution. The constituting subject is always an instituted entity. An objection against this sort of project of naturalization states that the subject of experience cannot be naturalized in these ways, since the transcendental subject is itself the condition of possibility of what we understand by nature. So, in other terms, a subject cannot emerge from nature if nature is constituted by the subject. Or, even in other terms, if transcendental philosophy studies the condition of possibility of the natural sciences, we cannot use this natural science to study the conditions of possibility of transcendental philosophy. So there is a sort of circle that this kind of, the people who endorse this argument do not like. Now, I think that here there is a sort of confusion in the utilization of the term nature. Of course, a subject of transcendental type alpha emerges by means of a natural process of institution from and within what we could call nature as such. And this kind of subject constitutes, by means of a transcendental framing, a particular objectivation of this nature. So we have to establish a more refined terminology. So in a sense, we can say that nature is traversed by natural processes of institution of transcendental structures, which in turn induce objective framings of this very nature. So we have to make a distinction between nature and the different possible objectivations of nature. One possible objectivation of nature for each possible transcendental type. Okay? Of course, we cannot avoid getting involved in a sort of circle, but this circle is not necessarily vicious. For instance, we are dealing with a problem and we realize that we cannot find a solution, and afterwards we realize that we cannot find a solution because of the fact that we are using the conceptual framework that we are using is limited, so we have to change the conceptual framework. But how can we change the conceptual framework if the only conceptual tools that we have is the conceptual framework? But well, science moves forward, and this is the magic of human creativity. We engage in these kind of circles, and we move forward. So to this essentialization of the transcendental structure, I will oppose what I will call its existentialization. That is to say, the thesis according to which every possible transcendental structure is the result of a process of institution. Here I prefer the old-fashioned term existentialization to the term naturalization, in order to stress that for me I think that the transcendental structure is the possible transcendental structures are not only natural structures, but they are also linguistic structures, social structure, political structure, etc. So in order to englobe all these kind of structures, I speak of existentialization instead of the restricted term naturalization. So naturalization is a particular conjugation of this existentialization. So what are the consequences of this existentialization of the transcendental subject? First, this is a problematic point. I'm not sure of what I'm saying. If transcendental structures are in particular natural structures, like for instance physiological structures, then the transcendental reflection has to be carried out by natural sciences and not by philosophy. If we want to understand the emergence of human beings qua natural entities, we have to become evolutionary biologists. And also, in the same vein, I think that the analysis and variations of the a priori conceptual framework of a discipline, such as, for instance, physics or mathematics, is a task of physics or mathematics itself. So who other than a physicist could be in the position of trying to understand the extremely complex structures of the conceptual framework that he or she is dealing with, and to afford the task of modifying these conceptual frameworks? So this distinction between a sort of natural of a sort of first order level associated to the natural science and a meta-conceptual level which would be the task of transcendental philosophy, I think that it is inconsistent with this existentialization of the transcendental structures. So we have to take at face value the fact that, okay, let's naturalize the transcendental structures, so we have to find other tasks for philosophy. Now, in the second place, the second consequence of this existentialization of the transcendental structures is that it opens the possibility of overcoming this transcendental perspectivism. That is to say, if a transcendental structure is a result of an ongoing dynamical process of institution, then we can inflect this process and induce mutations of the transcendental structures. Briefly, if the transcendental structures are not part of a supposed essence, transcendental essence of the human, then it's a fact that we can perform this kind of transcendental variations. Briefly, besides modifying our empirical position in space and time, we can also modify our position in what I have called the K-space. The fact that human experience is framed by a transcendental structure does not imply that we cannot modify, deform, or perturb the very transcendental conditions of this experience. And this is nothing mysterious. We know what this means. Well, so here we have some examples of what I understand by transcendental variations. We can mention, for instance, the chemical and the biotechnological expansion of the scope of human perception and motor functions, the biotechnological perturbation of the biological framing of human existence, the scientific and philosophical continuous reprogrammation of the categories of our understanding, the literary and philosophical labor on the linguistic organon, and also the modification of the a priori conceptual framework of natural sciences. And there is a point which is missing. Oh no. So these transcendental variations should not be understood as a sort of ultimate deliverance of human experience with respect to any form of transcendental framing, but rather as successful differential transgressions of the limits that apply for each particular occasion. So rather than gaining access to a hypothetical great outdoors, these variations allow us to absolve experience from any fixed transcendental framing. So here, even if we cannot have an unframed experience of nature, we can always try to modify the transcendental frame to identify the invariants and to try to integrate the experiences framed from different transcendental viewpoints. That is to say, from different positions, in this case, space. So, the last piece of terminology. No, I'm sorry. There is some differences. In particular, a transcendental variation, this is an important example, can take the form of what we could call a transcendental extension. That is to say, a transition from a transcendental structure alpha to a transcendental structure alpha prime, which extends while conserving the transcendental resources of alpha. I will give an example in a moment. No, in fact, well, it's okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, there is something which is missing, but no problem. So let me give an example. This is an example that I like because it's really simple. We can understand a number system as a sort of arithmetic language by means of which we can ask questions in the form of equations and look for the corresponding answers. So for instance, the natural numbers is plus the operation plus, minus, and time is a language in which we can formulate questions of the form, is there an x such that x plus 1 equals 3? Now we can find the answer to this question in the very language in which we have formulated the question. That is to say, we can find the answer x equals 2, which is a natural number. But human language has the incredible capacity to formulate questions that cannot be answered in the language at stake. That is to say, questions that point out towards a domain beyond the language. So, for instance, if I write the question x plus 1 equals 0, I can formulate this question by means of my language, the natural numbers, but the solution is not in the natural numbers. Okay? So, first of all, if my only language are the natural numbers, I could argue that this problem has no solution, but afterwards I can read Kant and realize that maybe the problem is in the limitations of my language. But once that I have done this, I could argue, okay, so this means that there is a sort of transcendent beyond to which I have no access because I'm essentially limited by the limits of my language. So I can write the Tractatus and say that the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and the only experience that I can have of this beyond is a sort of mystic or an experience of a sort of negative theology, the logical kind. But we can just go on working and try to extend our linguistic resources. That's a more modest solution, and that's what this is a kind of solution that permits science to move forward. So by doing this, we could pass from the natural numbers to the entire numbers. And now in the entire numbers, we know that there is a number which is x minus 1, which is a solution to my problem. Okay? So this historical process, this is really a very important conceptual leap. It's not trivial at all to perform this kind of extension of the transcendental resources of a language. So afterwards, this history moved forward. We can write questions in this new language. For instance, 2 times x equals 1, and this equation again it can be formulated in this language, but the solution is not in this language. So, but afterwards we realize that we can find a solution in the field of rational numbers, and this process created afterwards the real numbers, the complex numbers, etc. So this is an example of this alternative to the mystification of this outside to a given set of transcendental resources. Science does not work like that. So here I repeat myself. So let me introduce the last piece of terminology. I will call speculative any experience which envelops a transcendental variation of the transcendental frame. Of course, the subject of such an experience, which can no longer be understood as an instantiation of a transcendental subject, that is to say, as a token of a particular transcendental type, such a subject will be called not a transcendental subject, but a speculative subject. So a speculative experience entails, by definition, a speculative transcendence that goes beyond, so to speak, the transcendental transcendence. Now, the depth experience, so to speak, resulting from the integration of different transcendental viewpoints implies that the intentional pole of a speculative experience cannot be an object or an objective phenomenon located in what I have called objective nature. So, what I mean by this is that the very possibility of affording transcendental variations puts into question, I think, the sharp Kantian distinction between phenomena and noumena. Because we don't have this kind of fixed demarcation line between what we can say and the unsayable or the unthinkable or the impossible. There is no fixed demarcation line between something that we could call phenomena and something that we could call noumena. It doesn't make sense in science, according to me. So this Kantian dichotomy, I think that this terminology has to be improved. So I don't know how to do it, but I propose this idea. I propose to introduce a sort of terminological monster, phenomenon, okay? And what is a phenomenon? Well, a phenomenon can be defined as a sort of map. A phenomenon P is a sort of map that to each single transcendental type alpha associates a particular object, which is the objectivation of this phenomenon with respect to the transcendental frame alpha. Okay? So this phenomenon P assigns to any position alpha in this K space, that is to say to any transcendental structure, the object P sub alpha, which is embedded in the nature co-framed by the transcendental type alpha. So I don't know if this is clear enough. Any tiny questions?
Just explain this one more time, sorry.
Yes. Let me see. Yeah, I will. Let's. I will move forward to the next slide, and I will come back to this one. It will be clear, I think. So we have a phenomenon P, and for each transcendental type, we have the particular objectivation of P defined by the transcendental type under consideration. Okay. Now, given this objectivation of P, we have the sort of the same process at another level, which is given an objectivation P sub alpha. An objectivation P sub alpha can be understood as a map that assigns to any position X in the alpha spacetime the profile or the adumbration of the object P sub alpha that a subject of type alpha occupying the position X will experience. Okay? So what do I mean? I have an object, P sub alpha. Okay? This object is embedded in what we could call the alpha spacetime. Okay? In a particular transcendental dependent spacetime. So an empirical subject of the transcendental type alpha can move, can take a walk in this space and time. So can occupy different positions. Here, here, here. So this object can be understood as a map that to each position, x, x prime, x2 prime, this object to each position assigns a particular profile, which is the profile of this object as seen from here. Okay? So if I place a subject here, he will observe the object from here, and he will see, or she will see, a particular profile. If the subject is placed here, she will see another profile, and so on. So the object is a map that to each position assigns a profile. But now I can repeat this argument. Okay? Now I know that this object, okay, is just a particular objectivation of my phenomenon. Okay? So now I can write P as such, the phenomenon P, and I know that this is a particular objectivation of P. Which objectivation? The objectivation defined by a transcendental subject placed in the point alpha of the K space. Okay? So now I can do the same. Instead of changing my position in space and time, I can try to change my position in this K space. So for instance, I can place myself in the position alpha prime, and so I will observe a P alpha prime, which will be another object, the objectivation of P with respect to alpha prime, and so on. And of course, of this object, I have another space-time, and we'll have another set of profiles. Okay? Is it clear? So here we have what I have called empirical variations, which is to change the empirical position on space and time. And here we have what I have called transcendental variations, that is to say, to change the position in the space of transcendental structures.
That's what the phenomenon.
Huh?
This is the phenomenon.
The phenomenon is that which for each position in the K space defines a particular object. So in the same way that an object can be defined as something that for each position in space and time defines a particular profile. That's a well-defined definition of an object. Okay? It's something that irradiates profiles. So if you are in a particular position, you will record a particular profile. If you change your position, you will gain access to another profile. So it's exactly the same kind of argument, but taking place in another level. And of course, all this structure is interrelated. I mean, for instance, this transcendental variation could be a transcendental extension, in the sense that the transcendental structure alpha prime has a higher resolution than the transcendental structure alpha. So in that case, the two objects have to be related. In what way? The object P alpha will be a sort of coarse-grained version of the object P alpha prime, because P alpha prime is defined with respect to a transcendental structure with a higher resolution. So we have, it's not just a map, it's something that to each map of transcendental structure assigns a map between the corresponding objects. So there is a coherence in all this global structure. So I'm close to the end. It's okay?
Yep.
Is it clear, this scheme? So as you can see, this sort of terminological monster, the phenomenon, combines a phenomenal dimension and a nominal dimension. Why? Well, here I'm repeating again. Well, maybe it's worth reading this, because to fix ideas. A single phenomenon P induces a multiplicity of objects, one for each position in the K space, and in turn, each object induces a multiplicity of profiles, one for each position in the corresponding space and time. So, while a subject of a fixed transcendental type only can make the experience of a single object P alpha, what I have called a speculative subject has access to a whole range of objects, which are induced by framing the same phenomenon with respect to different transcendental frames. So, once again, a speculative subject can not only pass from a set of empirical profiles to the object of which they are the profiles, but she can also pass from a set of different objects to the single phenomenon of which these objects are the objectivations. So I resume what I was saying before. The nominal scope of the term phenomenon is intended to stress that every phenomenon is always in excess with respect to any of its possible objectivations. Okay? There is no objectivation that can encode all the richness of the phenomenon at stake. Okay? So in this sense, the phenomenon is always in excess with respect to its different possible objectivations. So this is why the phenomenon has a sort of nominal scope. However, while the Kantian nominal is subtracted to any form of manifestation, a phenomenon, as I have defined it, manifests itself, but in a manner that overflows any possible objectivation. So there is nothing which is on this side of manifestation, there is only manifestation, but this manifestation overflows any possible objectivation. So manifestation cannot be reduced to objectivity. And this, once again, does not mean that there is a sort of great outdoors to which we could have access by I don't know what kind of means. We are just raising the empirical Copernicanism to a transcendental level. So once again, this phenomenal dimension of the term phenomenon is intended to stress that this notion does not refer to any mysterious X in itself that would exist while being subtracted to any form of manifestation. So this is, you can take a look at the blackboard. So we have this, once again, we have these two levels of Copernicanism. We have the empirical Copernicanism, which means that by observing a certain object from all the possible spatiotemporal frameworks, that is to say, by performing variation in space and time, we can reconstruct in a faithful manner the object at stake. And the transcendental or the post-critical Copernicanism amounts to perform the same operation in the K-space. That is to say, not to perform variations in space and time, but to perform variations in the space of transcendental structures. So we could say that the task of speculative thinking is to perform a transcendental reflection in order to put into focus the transcendental structures that frame our experience. And then we have to see how we can perform these transvariations in the space of transcendental structures in order to finally try to integrate the different objectivations of the phenomenon at stake into a unique phenomenal-oriented description. So in order to conclude, we can say that we have to take a look into the transcendental glass and take care of the transcendental self in order to sublate the transcendental limits of experience in a never-ending process. So thanks for your kind attention. Yes.
And it strikes me that you might not want to say that the whole structure that you're talking about, the whole space of all these possible transcendental and empirical variations, necessarily has neatly behaved global sections. But you might want to say that there are phenomena that don't appear in certain transcendental or empirical variations.
Yes, I think so. I think that I agree with your idea. If I understand it, I mean, for instance, we can imagine a given phenomenon that only appears with respect to a certain scale of resolution. And if we increase the scale, we lose we don't see anything. So they are emergent phenomena. Okay, but is that what we are saying?
Yeah, it appears that the formalism you're giving for the phenomena, it doesn't appear to be compatible with that immediately, because it seems to imply that it has to appear everywhere.
No, because what I do not agree with you is with the idea of global section. Here, the concept at stake is not the notion of global section. Let's say that the mathematical underpinning of this kind of ideas is, as you know, the notion of a functor on the category of transcendental structures. And so such a functor is something that to each transcendental structure assigns not a section but a set. What set? The set of all the profiles of the object, of the objectivation of the phenomenon with respect to this transcendental structure. So that's the formal characterization of what I have said. That is to say, to each transcendental structure, a phenomenon assigns a set. What set? The set of all the profiles of the object that defined by the objectivation of this phenomenon with respect to this transcendental structure.
But it could assign like the empty set, for instance?
Yeah, of course. So there is no problem with global sections.
That makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Just, if I can, follow up on this and an historical illustration. In this kind of a framework, what would you want to do with the concept of an alleged phenomenon dealing with heat and combustion prior to Lavoisier? And that is, where does phlogiston fit into here? Is that just spurious and the only actual phenomena are the heat and combustion phenomena that phlogiston allegedly explained but didn't? Or does phlogiston turn out as a phenomenon in this structure, right? I mean, I'm trying to figure out which objects and which alleged objects we need to preserve in this episode of History of Science.
Yes.
Right, and obviously there's going to be counterparts and others, but just pick any example you wish. It doesn't have to be the phlogiston.
Well, I gave an example, the example of the extension of the natural system.
Yes.
So in that case, it's an example. It's a very particular example because the variation of the transcendental structure takes the particular form of an extension.
Right.
So I'm passing to a richer
Yes.
language in which I can say all what I could say before, but I can say more. Of course, when there is no overlap between two transcendental structures, it could be more difficult to. But I don't know. I don't know the details of the example that you are given. So
this is part of why I wanted to ask about whether, in the case of trying to explain physically, chemically, physiologically, combustion and what came soon to be known as oxidation phenomena, whether the relevant individuals to be preserved would have been examples of combustion and examples of transformations of metals and oxides that only later, post-Lavoisier, become explained in what we now understand to be oxidation and reduction. They had been thought of in terms of phlogiston, but there wasn't any, right? I mean, phlogiston turned out to be garbage category.
yeah, but I don't see why we should suppose that there is a sort of trans-framework continuity of individuals. Of course, the transcendental. I mean, what is an individual is a transcendental dependent notion.
That's
there is
why
a
I'm
criterion of
asking.
identity which is transcendental dependent. So we cannot.
That's why I'm asking whether phlogiston gets to count as an entity prior to Lavoisier.
Well, of course, there is a phenomenon to which the phlogiston, to which the notion of phlogiston try to account for, And of course, there is a continuity of the phenomenon, not of the notion that we use to try to understand what was going on. The phlogiston is just a conceptual, it's a concept. It's a concept that couldn't afford a trans framework, couldn't cross the limits of the conceptual framework in which it was formulated. So the continuity is not necessarily conceptual.
So alleged entities can become discarded in this process.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Just checking.
Yes, I think so.
I'm not trying to object.
Yeah, I think so.
Make sure I'm understanding.
I think so. For instance, we have a notion of space and time in general relativity, and people know that maybe in a quantum framework the notion of space and time disappears completely. We don't know, but it's a possibility. So, and we don't know what's the entity that will take the place of space and time, but of course it will be a sort of trans framework continuity of some kind, because but they are not necessarily individuals that cross the frontier. And once again, the criteria for identity and individuality is transcendental dependent in general, not necessarily, but thanks to you. More questions? Inigo.
Yeah. So how we take a walk in K-space, or how we induce a mutation in transcendental structure, is, I mean, you've said elsewhere about this, that it's not just theoretical, but happens in all forms of experience. And so it's not limited to the space of reasons.
Of course.
So I just wondered, okay, but could you explain?
Can I answer your first question?
Okay, but
okay,
yes.
go on.
Let me just add a little to that. So, isn't it the case that when we transcend the K-space by the example you gave is that we recognise the limitation of the linguistic framework in which we're operating.
Yes.
But isn't that happening according to a reason? And also, how do we know that we're not? How do we know if we're just not moving in empirical space rather than K-space, unless we have reasons for discerning that?
Well, I don't think that we can give general answers to these kind of questions. It's a question that has to be posited in each singular framework of research of whatever, and to perform a tiny transcendental variation is a huge task, which is very difficult, and I don't know, it could take centuries. So there is no method. It's the modesty of science. Just calm down. No, it's very, so instead of this kind of leaps, mystical leaps towards a great outdoors in science, it takes centuries to perform a tiny differential extension of your transcendental framework. There is no method for that, as far as I understand it.
There's no method to solve the problems we haven't yet identified even, right?
Oh, yes, of course.
We have to find the problems first, and then.
Yes, of course. One of the most difficult tasks of research is to formulate a well-posited problem or to find a good question, and it's not evident. It's an art. I don't know. There is no method in science for doing these kind of things. And with respect to the second point, of course, I think that theoretical reason is just one particular modality of experience among other modalities of experience. There is conceptual experience, but there is also emotional experience, social experience, perceptual experience. And in order to mediate the limits of these different modalities of experience, we need different kind of operators. So science can only help us to expand our limits, the limits of our conceptual experience. But so in this case, we move in the so-called space of reasons, but there are other kinds of spaces in which, other kinds of K-spaces, if you want, in which to perform a variation doesn't mean to move in the space of reasons. It means move in the political space of possibilities. I don't know. So for me, the theoretical the inflation of theoretical reason is also against the scientific spirit. Maybe there are other questions by people who didn't. And
I was just wondering, because some of the things you talked about reminded me of the theory of Karen Farad and her idea of the performative metaphysics, and I was wondering if you see any relation to that, because it seems to me that what you're proposing with the phenomenon has something in common with her phenomenon, which she says very clearly that it's not the phenomenon of Kant, it's something more, it's something that emerges in an interaction, so something more like the lines maybe on your map as opposed to the different points. And also she, yes, I was wondering if that's if you know her work and if you see any relation, because she draws from physics. And
yeah, I haven't read her work, so
of diffraction, and you talked about reflection and refraction. So
well, I don't know her work well enough, but in particular, she, as far as I know, she comes from physics, as you said, and I think that she endorses a sort of transcendental interpretation of quantum mechanics. She works in the field of quantum mechanics, as far as I know, and I think that this kind of scheme is completely orthogonal to what I'm describing, because I think that this kind of projects or position are still in an interpretation of the transcendental framework, which is not this one, because they are still, for instance, it's difficult because I should get into the subject. They have an interpretation of quantum mechanics according to which quantum mechanics is a sort of intrascientific formalization of the transcendental limitations of knowledge, of the idea that there are no things in themselves, that every possible object is defined with respect to an experimental setup or whatever. And there is no way to go beyond this sort of transcendental limit, and quantum mechanics is nothing but the intrascientific formalization of this limitation. So this is a sort of interpretation of the transcendental position, which evidently is very different from here, because here I'm arguing that we can go beyond any kind of objectivation, and that's doing science. So in particular, I think that it's not the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. That doesn't mean that I not know the correct one, but I'm really against these kind of positions, if you want. But once again, I don't know her work well enough, so maybe what I'm saying is not faithful enough to what she says. So I don't know. Yes, please.
Thanks for that. This is all incredibly new to me, so I'm going to want to fairly speculative question. You mentioned earlier on our reflective ability to identify framing, precisely the ability to think about framing.
Yes.
More generally, which I guess that makes it a particular kind of subject. I wonder whether that ability doesn't itself place limits on the kinds of things that the ways in which we can frame, and thus, in general, principle limits upon or rules for the kinds of framings, the types of modifications we can make to framings. So, I'm looking for some principle and some hook for a principle that's going to delimit the kinds of modifications to framings we can have. Not at any given point in history or whatever, but absolutely. Because I presume frames can't be anything at all.
Well, this is, once again, it's a question that the answer to this question is context dependent. No? In each particular situation, the class of available frames of reference is fixed by the problem at stake. So there is no, and it's the problem at stake which tells you what are the class of frames of reference that you can use. I don't know if what else I could say.
Yeah.
For instance, if you are doing physics on Minkowski spacetime, the fact that you are presupposing that your physics takes place in Minkowski spacetime means that there is a group of available frames of reference, which is the Poincaré group.
So there's no meta frame rules. There's
No. I mean, if you are doing quantum field theory of Minkowski spacetime, you have to use the Poincaré class of frames of reference. It's fixed by the problem that you are studying.
But anything, you talk about emotional frames and all sorts of frames.
Yes,
Right.
but I don't have any kind of general description.
But given that we're the ones who are doing the framing,
I'm sorry?
given that we're the kinds of beings, I mean, is it any and all kinds of beings who do this framing?
Well, of course, I don't know if I understand you, but of course, the fact that the space-time, let's go to the first example, the fact that the space-time in which we can move is transcendental dependent means that the class of frames of reference that I can embody depends on my transcendental structure. I mean, if I assume that the space-time of a tick is not the same kind of space-time that of a human being, of course, the frames of reference that a tick can occupy are more restricted than the frames of reference that the human being can occupy. So the class of frames of reference is transcendental dependent, if you want. I don't know if I'm getting closer to.
That's one way to answer the so the types of things, ways in which we can frame are dependent on whatever kind of beings we are.
Yes, that's the whole point of this drawing, of this scheme, no? Here I can move here in this space of possible spatiotemporal positions, but this very space of possible spatiotemporal position depends on my transcendental structure. So the frames of reference that I can occupy or that I can use is transcendental dependent. So in order to extend, for instance, or change the class of available frames of reference, I have to perform a sort of transcendental variation.
Okay. So frames in principle could be anything, but
in physics, this is a very subtle problem, no? And the history of how people change, pass from different frames, from different classes of frames of reference, it's a very complex and sophisticated, a very complex story. For instance, at one point, people thought that the symmetry group of physics was the Poincaré group because we live in Minkowski spacetime. But afterwards, Einstein came and he said, well, Minkowski spacetime is a tangent description to your spacetime, but the global structure of your spacetime can have any kind of geometry. So the idea that we can use any kind of frame related by a Poincaré transformation is no longer valid. Now we have to use another class of frames because we realize that we are living in a world in which the Minkowski description is local. Yeah.
Frames change.
Yeah, frames change. The class of available frames change. That's an important part in the history of science.
Sure.
Yes.
Sorry, it's really too late.
Okay, we can go on.
Yeah.
So thanks again.